All right. Hey, everyone. I hope you all are safe and managing to find time to practice some self-care during these quarantine times. I'd love to welcome you all to today's program entitled Documenting Privilege, which is the third installment of a new series sponsored by Otis entitled Focus. So Focus is a program designed to offer students in the wider university community, the chance to participate in some really meaningful discussions with some of the most foremost anti-racist writers, activists, and thinkers in the world. We also would like to acknowledge our partner in providing books to Princeton undergraduates for the Focus series. So Source of Knowledge Bookstore in Newark, New Jersey is a Black-owned independent bookstore that has been a cornerstone of this work in their community. And we're super grateful for their assistance and encourage all of our viewers to find them on Facebook. So in today's focus session, Dean Melissa Thompson will moderate a conversation between Professor Peralta and Professor Jack on how issues of race and socioeconomic status impact college students, and how we can begin to overcome the discrimination and equity still embedded in higher ed. And the conversation will be immediately followed by a Q&A session. So if at any point in today's conversation you have a question, please feel free to use the question and answer feature on Zoom. We'll try our best to get to your question answered later tonight. And this session is also being recorded, so you all will have the opportunity to sort of watch it back at a later date. I'll now introduce our fabulous panelists. And before I do, I would also just like to say that as a first generation Dominican Harlemite, I can't begin to express how excited I am to witness tonight's conversation that I know will surely be really profound. So with that, our first panelist for tonight is Dan-el Padilla Peralta, who is an associate professor of classics at Princeton University, self-described Dominican by birth and New Yorker by upbringing. Professor Peralta graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University in 2006 with a degree in classics, along with a certificate from SPIA, and delivered the salutatorian address. He was awarded the Daniel M. Sachs Class of 1960 graduating scholarship to read for the Master in Philosophy in Greek and Roman History at Oxford, and he earned a PhD in classics from Stanford in 2014. He actually just joined Princeton's faculty in 2016, and in addition to his appointment in the Department of Classics, he holds affiliations with the programs in Latino Studies and Latin American Studies and the University Center for Human Values. He is the author of Undocumented, a Dominican boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League, and Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Republic. And he has co-edited Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation. His writing, teaching, and research are guided by a firm commitment to anti-racist principles. We also are honored to have Professor Anthony Jack as a panelist tonight as well. Professor Jack is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and an assistant professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He holds the Schutzer Assistant Professorship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and his research documents the overlooked diversity among lower income undergraduates, the doubly disadvantaged, those who enter college from local, typically distressed public high schools, and then the privileged poor, those who do so from boarding, day, and preparatory high schools. His scholarship appears in the Common Reader, Du Bois Review, Sociological Forum, and Sociology of Education, and has earned awards from the American Education Studies Association, among many others. Professor Jack holds multiple fellowships, including one from the Ford Foundation, and the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan named him an Emerging Diversity Scholar. In May 2020, Muhlenberg College awarded him an honorary doctorate for his work in transforming higher education. And of course, our amazing moderator for tonight is Dean Mel Thompson. Dean Thompson attended Cornell University, where she earned a bachelor's in sociology, and she later attended the Rutgers University School of Education, where she earned her master's of arts. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, she's worked with high school students and undergrads throughout her entire professional career. And Dean Thompson currently coordinates and manages crisis intervention efforts and emergencies involving undergrads at Princeton. So I actually want to thank all of our panelists and our moderator for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our panelists.
Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Karibet, for the incredible introduction. I feel blown away and delighted to be in the company of Professor Jack and to be in virtual company of all of you. So yeah, where should we begin? Talk about this documenting privilege business. And I guess one question I had, I've been thinking a lot about your book because it talks about institutions that are near and dear to me, from the renowned institution at its heart to organizations like Prep for Prep in New York City. I guess one question I had and that I've been trying to sort out my own answers to is, what do you think the longitudinal effects of the university's management of distinctions between the privileged poor and the doubly disadvantaged look like? So do you think that the story that you tell is one that has a 10 to 15 year arc beyond the experiences of those at the university, and that this arc actually plays itself out in terms of the kinds of ideological and meritocratic investments that play out in the lives of the privileged poor and the doubly disadvantaged?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Before I answer, I just want to say thank y'all for this invitation. I mean, to put these two books together, the you and I in conversation, this is amazing. So I'm super excited about this, and forgive me now for geeking out because that's what I'm going to do. It's a great question. It's one that I get quite a bit, and to be honest, I think it does play out. And yes, elite students who graduate from elite schools tend to do better in the labor market overall, right, than other groups, right? People who get BAs over, associate's degrees, and we see it on that level. Then we see it by gradation of type of school. The more selective the school, the greater the economic potential. The real difference is cumulative effect, because the doubly disadvantaged are more likely to have a delayed entry to careers that they end up staying into. They even if 20 years down the line, both people have went into medicine or finance or education, the privileged poor typically had a much more direct route to graduate school or to whatever credentialing program they had to go into than the doubly disadvantaged. So it's usually from what I'm observing, there's a 3 to 5 year gap in stepping on the established path that you're going to continue on. And what I didn't know, there was a study way back in the day when Harvard was all male, and even more, even wider than it is now, where public school graduates, even white men from working class and lower middle class background, working class and poor backgrounds, they invested in academic capital when they were at school. They did not do the socializing and the networking, and they were more likely to go to the public sector for jobs after than the private sector. Similar things is playing out. But as you know, and we all know people from Prep for Prep and the like, Prep for Prep doesn't wait for you to get to college to do internships on Wall Street, right? Some of those students started while they were in high school. They did internships with people in finance and medicine and law since they were in high school. And so that process, Prep for Prep doesn't exist to diversify prep schools. They don't even exist to diversify colleges. They want to diversify corporate America, right? That's where a lot of their funding goes. And so there is a lot of career funneling that exists in these programs long before the impact of Princeton or Harvard or Amherst is put on anyone.
I mean, that resonates powerfully, both with my experiences of Prep for Prep and also with what I've seen as characteristic of the pathways taken by Prep for Prep alums and by folks who participated in broadly similar programs. And I think that what's undoubtedly in play is the relationship of corporate America, and specifically, the sort of funneling of the privileged poor towards corporate America that you see with Prep for Prep. And I guess this too has me thinking that, one story that you take up and explore in the book, and something that has been of interest to me as I sort of reflect on the pathways that were visible or legible to me, is the existence of these organizations like Prep for Prep that exercise this kind of gatekeeping function, right? I mean, I think one of the most powerful aspects of your book is when you do talk about, you have the two Latina students, one of whom is admitted to prep, the other whom is not admitted to prep. Even though they end up at the same undergraduate institution, how they can enter and navigate those spaces is profoundly altered by the fact that one of them had access to all these opportunities opened up by prep for prep and the socialization that came with that, right? And the other did not.
Because the question that I was hoping that we would talk about is something that I don't get to talk about nearly as much in the book, and it's because of my research design, is to understand poverty in America. I set my research design such that I only interviewed students who were born in the United States to control for some factors. Like if you were born outside the US and you lived there until you were 16, but then you came to the US, you have a very different understanding of poverty. But the question I wanted to talk to you about is the immigrant experience as well as the first gen experience. And theoretically, I talk about how the two overlap, right? Learning a new culture, new rules, new custom, new rituals. But I was wondering if you could speak on that even more, especially from the earlier perspective of before you even come and having to navigate these kind of programs in a way that you have to be both broker and translator.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic invitation to think critically about this. And I'd say that my own thinking here has evolved over the past 15 to 20 years. So in the memoir, I spend a lot of time, especially at these sort of junctures in upward mobility, stating in quite explicit terms that I felt, profoundly disadvantaged by virtue of the fact that my own, immigrant background, and crucially, my family's immigrant background, hadn't presented us with the kinds or made available to us the kinds of cultural capital that we could harness at moments like, the college application process, even if I had a dedicated college counselor, right? But at the same time, something that came clear and clear to me, thanks to the work of folks in Princeton sociology department, and I'm thinking in particular of the work of Patricia Fernandez Kelly and Alejandro Portes, is that there were forms of cultural capital that I carried with me as an immigrant, and that were mediated by the fact that my parents were, coming from the Dominican Republic, of middle-class backgrounds, and had both had access to higher degrees of education, and as a result, had been socialized into staking their own pursuit of opportunities in this new country to a set of values that were legible to them, and that were like broadly congruent with like the kinds of upward mobility fixations that characterize immigrants in sort of this particular swath of the diaspora. So like, I feel that on some level, the answers that I would give to your question are, have shifted and, sort of will continue to shift as I reflect on the many gradations and striations of privilege that define how different immigrant communities relate to each other. On the specific question that has occupied me lately about the relationship between Afro-Caribbean communities in particular and African Americans, especially in higher ed in the United States, and how different kinds of privilege become operationalized in these contexts. We used to have this joke in Prep for Prep when we were, both when we were, those of us who were working there were sort of working with students, and also when those of us participating in the admissions process were reviewing sort of interview transcripts or applications. We would talk about JBs, we would talk about folks who were just Black. And we would say, the JB label was our way of differentiating from folks who were multi-generationally African-American in the US from people who were Afro-Caribbean. And we would look at the composition of Prep for Prep's classes and say, we got a lot of Afro-Caribbean folk, we got a lot of Afro-Latina folk, we have very few JBs. Like, so what do you do about this, right? But like, this story tells itself over and over again in the settings where Prep for Prep and allied organizations does the great deal of the work that it sets out to do to diversify. Because yes, when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, I encountered a lot of Afro-Caribbean folks, including people who were like really privileged. But where were the JV folks who were doubly disadvantaged of the sort that you evoke and whose experiences you narrate in your book? There were very few of those, and they were very few of them for a reason.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, and it's interesting because, Doug Massey, who is in the sociology department there as well, actually published an article that sparked a lot of conversation about the generational, what basically was an article by Sarah Reimer in the New York Times, elite colleges admit more Black students, but which ones? And found out there's a disproportionate representation of Black students from the diaspora, specifically the Caribbean and Africa, that compared to where you were thinking, brought a lot of conversations about affirmative action and the like. Because the thing about, like you mentioned in your story, is the translating of home degrees to the US, but then also how the specific education system that we have here doesn't permit the kind of, even if you have sometimes, especially from the immigrant perspective, the same kind of values and orientations, but that kind of the contrasting of the cultural norms that happens within schools, especially in these type of programs, that at least the lead up with prep can begin to educate both the students and the families on it. But for those students who enter these programs blind, right, who enter these schools completely as a scholarship kid, or as sometimes even an athletic recruit, they don't have that kind of socialization to understand. You all read, I know you always read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And what other big books y'all used to that prep students read?
Richard Wright. Richard Wright was huge.
There's a lot of socialization that happens that you don't that doesn't necessarily exist. But it is very interesting the number of students who arrive at the school, and it's a great article. And if I'm not mistaken, it's not Bourdieu has an article, Forms of Capital, but there's another article by some immigration scholars, I believe under the same title, that talks about the various resources that immigrant families can bring, whether it's networks, whether it's cultural capital, or even their academic capital, even if their credentials don't transfer, right? And so how do we also must rethink about mobility and inequality when we may think of someone as, oh, their father is a taxi driver, but in their home country they were a nurse or a doctor, right? How do we even begin to understand how that plays out, let alone once they get on campus? Yeah, it's just
No, I mean that's also, again, thinking about the embodied experiences that my peers brought to their college experiences, your peers brought to their college experiences, and that we sort of both see now playing out at our respective institutions. It is instructive for me to see that already when I was an undergraduate, and I'm thinking of one of the pieces that heralded the line of argument you sketched just now, this piece by Victor Nee and Jimmy Sanders that came out.
Thank you.
The Understanding the Diversity of Immigrant Incorporation one. Already when I was an undergraduate, I had this sense that there was like something very hard to convey about the structured mismatch between the educational and economic capital that my parents had amassed in our home country and like the non-transferability of that capital, right? Like, I mean, I sensed that this was an issue, but like I was still, reaching for a vocabulary with which to express that. And then of course, like, as I sort of began on the path to professionalization within a specific sector of the academy, more and more instantiations of this mismatch became visible to me, both as a teacher and as a scholar, right? So like you would see it playing out again with other generations of students who are encountering similar or broadly analogous experiences in navigating how their difference was playing out on college campuses. Or you would see it in advising context, right? Because I would feel the sort of pang of visceral identification with students for whom I was a mentor, And I would think to myself, wow, like, this story is very similar to my own. Like, our parents were taxi drivers, and like, and yet our parents had these educations. But then, and this is the question that I keep turning back to nowadays. I wonder if anything has structurally shifted over the past 10 years. And really, I mean, we can talk about the past 4 years, but in terms of these dynamics of incorporation that, Nee and Sanders flag, I mean, is it the case now that we should be sort of even more attentive to the non-transferability of skills that many immigrant children can report as having been true for their parents' families, if only because the immigration system and like the carceral state side of the immigration system in particular is making it even harder for immigrants to practice this kind of transferable work? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think where we it's to act the question that what your question gets at is a much larger pattern of what does actually poverty and inequality look like in America, right? And when we think about everything from the legacy of Jim Crow, like not just slavery and Jim Crow, but how it was built into the FHA loans, redlining, and blockbusting, right? That disproportionately affected generational African Americans, right, or the JBs as you call them, right? And so for those of us who identify or who can trace our lineage back 2 or 3 generations and still be in America, right, we have to understand the legacy of those systems that discriminated and excluded us from this particular thing, from access to resources. When you think about the GI, when you think about affirmative action for white people, all the programming that literally created the white middle class, right? GI Bill, FHA loans, all these particular things, and then the policy that discriminated against African Americans on the one hand, but then also the political structures that protected certain immigrant groups and let their skills be easily not even if their degrees didn't transfer, their skill was the priority, and they were able to get picked up by tech firms and other entities, but other like the medical field, law, other places was not as easily transferable. Like, we need not a machete to fit this. Like, we need a scalpel, right? We need like one policy won't address this. We actually need to make sure that we understand the root causes for the differential exposure to poverty and inequality for both those 2 groups, because one is rooted in laws that are facing on who gets to come in, and the other is based on laws about who gets to rise up. And those are 2 different approaches and 2 different tactics that we must now fight against, or rather fight for institutional policies that address those entrenched inequalities. And that's something that's very, very different. Because when you think about, for example, gerrymandering means something very specific for generational African Americans. And now, because of recent attacks on the census, how do you count immigrants? How do you count immigrants who are not in the country with paper? How do you do all of that? Now it becomes a different kind of issue. But gerrymandering has been a ploy of politics to keep Blacks from the voting booths, in secondary positions, no access to resources for generations. And so how do we begin to understand the differential effect of these type of policies? And so that's why when you were asking a question, I was thinking, like, we have, Mary Waters has an article where she puts forth a theory of proximal host, where when immigrant groups come in, they get slotted into a very strict and unchanging American racial order, and how certain groups are able to blend in, get in different kind of ways, versus other groups are, because of their skin tone or because of how they practice their religion, are immediately labeled and put next to that group. But their experiences, as she argues, their experiences with the law and policy are very different, even if interpersonally they have similar experience with racism, discrimination, and exclusion. And unless we attack both, then the way in which we talk about inequality will always be incomplete.
No, I mean, that's real talk on a number of fronts. One of the topics that's been taking up a fair bit of bandwidth in my mind these days is how Latino identity is constituted in relation to white supremacist structures that do enforce various forms of, ethno-racial gridding. And I keep coming back to this piece by the Dominican American scholar Silvio Torres Sayant, Inventing the Race, Latinos and the Ethno-Racial Pentagon, where, came out in 2003, still feels fresh. And he takes Latino folk to account for what he perceives as the tendency on the part of Latinx scholarly spokespersons to display, in his words, excessive zeal in the attempt to show that the racial experience of their community defies the existing official categories, even at the same time that Latino folk who can capitalize on whiteness or passing for whiteness profit and leverage the possibility of adlection into whiteness, right? So like there is this tension here that, as you pointed out, has implications for how we think about institutional design and questions of policy too. Because to speak of the institutions at which we at least notionally ply our trades, the university. What is the university's responsibility as an institution that seeks to manage in a corporatist way at times ethno-racial difference? And so what are the responsibilities of people at every layer of the university, from admissions to student support to faculty who are involved in teaching, to administrators who are involved in sort of broader questions of institutional design. All of the members of this community participate in the project of racial management, but that participation is profoundly unequal, obviously. Like, different people and different stakeholders exercise different degrees of power over this. So this is, what I'm left thinking about, as I reflect on the many points of contact between your work and mine. What are the responsibilities of the university? Like what should it be doing, especially in a 2020 moment where things are real wild. But as you pointed out, like the longue durée of the wildness, the fact that we are talking about structures of racial oppression that have a longue durée is what's at stake. And thinking about that longue durée is important if we're to move towards a more equitable future.
I mean, one thing, I don't know if you get angry at this, but I do. Why do universities only speak up when affirmative action is under attack?
Yeah, I get mad about this all the time.
As if all the policies that are being implemented and debated that make affirmative action needed in some respects more now than when it was initially thought of, why not attack those policies too? Why not address them just as much with the same fervor and amicus briefs and white papers and collective organizing against these kind of issues? I mean, are you okay with gerrymandering? Are you okay with voter suppression? Are you okay with all the attacks on not just civil liberties but basic fundamental facts and rights? I understand that universities are supposed to be apolitical institutions and blah 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 blah, but I'm thinking to myself, like, you only speak up if you can find the rationale for speaking up against attacks on affirmative action. Then invest in finding the rationale to stay whatever in the realm of neutrality you need to be in to address some of the fundamental injustices in this country. Period.
Yeah. And like, I mean, this is what, I mean, I'm not even gonna front about this for a moment. I find this to be infuriating that universities are so reluctant, to put it nicely, to confront the full range of instruments of racial oppression that act in the contemporary moment to enact violence against members of our communities, right? And so this is, earlier when I was saying, the university approaches the management of ethno-racial difference as a corporatist strategy. I meant that very deliberately, right? Because like one of the ways that you play this game is precisely by doing what we're both very critical of, we're only going to jump into the fray when affirmative action is under assault, or we are only going to jump into the fray when exemplary immigrants in our community are under assault, right? But like if you can't reckon with the multidimensionality of the forms of oppression, past and present, that dictate the form of the university and its profoundly inequitable configuration, then like, what are you doing other than just playing this game of middle management, right? I mean, that's to me what drives me up a wall. That's why I think it's really important that universities, not just pay lip service, as many have been doing over the past few months, to the pursuit of racial equity, but say, all right, like the current forms of racial inequity that we see exist at the intersection point of many structures of oppression, all of which the university is implicated in, and to which the university is answerable. So let's work on this. We can walk and chew gum,
Because right now we want to do like cluster hires, right? But cluster hires don't change the culture of campus. Both at the undergraduate level, at the administrative level, at the faculty level, it do not. Now, don't get me wrong. Do your cluster hires because y'all need some more Black and brown folks on your campuses. Period. Right? Like I'm not even going to say that's not important. But unless you do that other work, then those same people are going to be overburdened.
Yep.
Because I'm pretty sure I'll preach to the choir where if I say we advise more students than other people, we mentor more students, we are the faculty advisor for more clubs, and we hear more of the calls at different hours that are not celebratory calls, but rather calls of like asking someone asking us to talk them off of a cliff because of all the pain the institution has inflicted upon them, right? And so it is that corporate structure. It is colleges saying in the midst of COVID-19 that they should not touch their endowments because of their charge to protect the future generation. Literally, you are saying that endowments are worth more than people in this present moment. Because we're not asking you to spend down the entire damn thing, which is not what's being asked, but literally just being asked to make sure that people can keep their jobs, students can be supported, staff members can make whatever adjustments that are needed to be both productive and to still be people. And do whatever we all need to do to keep our humanity at stake. You rather say that you have allegiance to the endowment. No, you have a fiscal responsibility to the university, but that doesn't mean you can't take actions to support the people who make up the university now. And so there's a lot of things that are at place when we think about, and the thing is, like, I'm not trying to say the universities are off the hook at all. But then when you think about how Title IX and sexual assault has been started to be gutted, right, in some respects from the national government, and how universities are responding from it, you have that executive order that basically, if you tell the truth, you can lose funding. So you can't say that white people own slave unless you also say this, but then you can't say the first thing because that's presenting white people in a bad light. Like, that's literally what the executive order is. If you can't present white people in a good light, not even neutral, you can't have the kind of programming, right? All of this is like, but you're doing it because of the money, right? You're doing it because of the funding streams. And so it's easy for us in some respects to be at Harvard and Princeton and say, oh, let's do something good because we don't have to worry about the money. But how this is having a stranglehold on tuition dependent institutions or our public institutions, that's where I'm even more afraid of the kind of corporate structure and its influence, and it's keeping the attention away from people who are at the intersections of different systems of oppression, because they can't afford to even begin to tread in that way. They can't even afford to even start hosting a committee or a working group, because it would be in direct conflict of their funding streams and different other opportunities. So like, the attack isn't on the few institutions that can keep going without certain money coming in, it's hurting the much larger swath of higher education, especially our public institutions, which means that there's going to be a generation of students who know even less about America's truer angels and its devilish ways.
Yeah.
Period.
I mean,
like, that's just what we're going to end up being.
Yeah. And like, I mean, this is, and I'll ask Dean Thompson to come on so we can transition to the Q&A, but I mean, this is why, when I encountered, back over the summer, this McSweeney's piece that mocked the endowment focused obsessions of university presidents, this McSweeney's piece that came with the line, the endowment does not exist for you, you exist for the endowment. I was laughing my head off because I thought, what is being missed here, especially by institutions that have the kinds of financial resources that our employers do, is to take a proactive stand against the evisceration of education as a public good, the evisceration
Yes.
of the kind of education that would enable the people who benefit from it to participate in the work of demolishing these structures of racial oppression, and that would empower members of our communities to be the civic actors that they should be. But this means that educational institutions like ours have to think in redistributive terms. Like, you have to think about, well, what you're going to do with these billions of dollars in the endowment. You can't just wait for them to continue, these dollars to continue accumulating. Like, you have to say, all right, like, we have to commit to a program of redistributing our assets such that as we build towards a more equitable future, we come to the support of public institutions that are seeing the kinds of programming that they can undertake, the kinds of curriculum that they can design, eviscerated by very targeted and very directed federal initiatives that at this current moment are part and parcel of the structural oppression that we both been taught. So.
Now, the interesting thing is, and you hit on something that Tress McMillan Cottom said, in all of this, there hasn't been a stance for a defense of higher education without any kind of caveats or a specific nature of endowment or of this kind of, but a defense of higher education. As people were lamenting Zoom University and going online and how people should just take a year off, which pissed me off because they know the only people who can take a year off and it not affect the mobility are a very slim, you have to be white, male, and upper middle class for it to be completely like not affect your future. Those three characteristics have to be in play. And then you go out, and then the more you go out from that, the more it affects you. But like a defense of higher education as part of a national, that as far as it being truly a national campaign for us to be better, there is like, it's very interesting that at the time people are bemoaning higher education and saying it's a whole bunch of elite people talking to each other and who are standoffish and bougie and all kind of other stuff, are the same people who say, like, now, why don't we have a vaccine yet? Why do vaccines take so long? So I'm talking the same people who damn near failed 8th grade chemistry or 8th grade science, who say that higher education is not worth it, now want a vaccine at an unprecedented timeline, right? The disconnect is so real that the value of education is already under attack, let alone higher education is the main target. And that's scary to me. And I didn't realize it until she said it. She was like, of all the conversation that we are part of, name me one piece, one article, one op-ed, one podcast where people have just said, I am going to sit here and defend higher education from all attackers. Even as we are dependent on people who don't just have BAs, but people who go have PhDs and MDs, who went for additional schooling after undergrad. I don't know. Like, it boggles the mind for me. It's just, yeah. I mean, like, how do you want to to say one thing that, like, just say, like, oh, this is not worth anything. I don't want my daughter or my son to go and have to do this. It's a waste of money. But then you want the benefits of that whole enterprise at your fingertips. I don't understand that disconnect in people's minds.
Wow, I was off camera and I was nodding my head vigorously and snapping away. I'm glad I was off camera for that, but I just want to thank you both for dropping these gems this afternoon for our participants. And I want us to continue to engage in this discussion as we open it up for Q&A for the participants. And we've started to actually get some questions in the chat here. One of the first questions from an attendee is the privileged poor referring to low-income students attending elite high schools, colleges, or both?
Oh, that's a great question. Specifically, when I define the term privileged poor, it is lower income students who attend boarding day and preparatory high schools. And the other group being the W disadvantaged, lower income students who attend public schools. Privileged poor has the benefit of also capturing the presumed experience of all lower income students at selective colleges, whereas you are low income, but you should feel privileged, or you should feel, or you should see yourself as privileged for being in a school like Harvard or Princeton. And I kind of push back on that notion through the stories of students, but specifically, the term is a label that I use for lower income students who attend prep schools. And just to give you an understanding of where it comes from, Max Weber has a concept called ideal types, where he uses these concepts to, since the social world is so complicated and so complex, he uses these concepts to actually help simplify the world into categories or to frameworks that help us get a better handle on that complexity.
Thank you so much for that response. One of our next attendees says, aren't endowments heavily contracted with the alum or individual who has donated to the university and are thus not as flexible to spend however the university wants because it has strings attached to how it's actually spent? My understanding is it's not just a savings account meant to be spent however the university wants. The attendee wants to share that this is not an attack on the idea that universities need to do more to protect its most vulnerable population, including staff, but rather a question about how can we shift from using the rhetoric that endowments can be used however we want, to how do we find ways to fundraise and create resources that specifically help our vulnerable populations?
So I want to thank the attendee for lodging this question. I have a few answers, but I think that Tony's gonna have a few answers too. But let me start out first with, a statement of fact, and then I'm gonna venture an analysis of rhetoric. The statement of fact is that yes, no question that there are differences between restricted and unrestricted funds and endowments. That there are legal encumbrances on the use of certain kinds of endowments that are invested by the university as a result of bequests by alums and individuals. But here's the more salient for my purposes statement of fact. Universities, in particular our employers, spend a non-trivial amount of time with their legal teams trying to figure out what the conditions for the expenditure of restricted funds are. Exactly, like trying to sort out what can you do? What is it legally permissible to do with these funds? So what I'm asking, and this addresses the question about rhetoric, about moving beyond rhetoric. What I'm asking is that universities like ours, at a minimum, actually direct the resources of their legal arms to exploring creative and unprecedented uses of their endowments in these times that everyone keeps referring to as unprecedented, right? So, I mean, to the extent that that work is underway, I think the folks who are leading it, and to the extent that more of that work needs to be done, I call on our employers to do that work. The final point I'll make, though, is that there is something sort of striking to me about the tendency on the part of those who sort of object to the liberation of the endowment, as I'll call it. It's this appeal to the idea that, well, the endowment isn't just a savings account. I mean, sure, it's not just a savings account. It's actually many more things than just a savings account. It is a vehicle for capital and for the reproduction of capital. So if we want to think about what endowments can do, we have to start by asking ourselves, what are the ethical responsibilities of a university institution that relies on an investment vehicle in order to deliver and execute on its priorities? Like, what kinds of responsibilities accrue to institutions in this 21st century moment when we see that global capitalism and racial capitalism is tearing apart the fabric of our communities? Does that mean that at a minimum we have to reinterrogate the collusion and connivance of universities with the instruments of racial capital? Does that mean that universities have to be much more transparent about their endowments? The answers to these questions, as far as I'm concerned, are yes.
Yeah. I'm glad you touched on the difference between restricted and unrestricted funds, but for a little bit more context for those students who may not know. So a restricted fund is that when you dictate exactly what the money must be used for. Unrestricted means that you just give a donation to a college. The question that I am not worried about with the larger endowment of itself, but the interest on the endowment and how you fund the institution based upon the interest on it. So if you have a 29 or $13 billion endowment and you get to spend upwards of 8% of the interest on it. So if you think of it as a savings account, what is the interest rate on, what is the income off the interest of a $13 billion endowment, right? And you get to spend that. And a university can adjust how much it does spend of the interest off of the endowment. And so that's where things become a little different. But as far as the university's role, and I'm inspired by this book by he was actually, so Eddie Cole was actually my dissertation, my Spencer faculty advisor, but he actually outlines the way in which college presidents have had a hand in gentrification, desegregation, Jim Crow policies, like actually colluding on some ends, sometimes working with elected officials to create policies that either benefit the university at the best of times and benefit only white segregationists or white communities on the other. So there are many times throughout history that we have seen the university use its resources to be active in this kind of way. Maybe not in it is a form of activism, but their activism was to keep segregation, to keep certain schools like the University of Maryland from introducing more Black students and doing different things like that. So when I ask questions about president's defense of not using the endowment, it's not writing themselves a blank check, but it's how do we appropriate the resources that we have already, how do we allocate resources based upon the model that we already have? And then secondarily, should we question the model that we have?
Thank you both for that response. We have another
great question.
Yeah, it was a great question. Thank you for the participant that asked that question. Another attendee has asked, how do you see, and this is for both of you, given your involvement with Prep for Prep, how do you see organizations like Prep for Prep influencing, if at all, their students' sense of racial, ethnic, or cultural identity? And how do these organizations ensure they don't weight one kind of cultural capital, for example, white and wealthy, over others?
Ooh, this is a juicy question. Ooh, okay, so I'm going to reflect briefly on my experiences as a student of Prep for Prep, and then as an alum who worked in an advising role for the program. So one of the things that with hindsight stands out about my formation of racial and ethnic identity at Prep for Prep was the emphasis on a discourse of overcoming. And I would say that it took several forms. So, for example, one of the poems that featured prominently on the commencement program of Prep for Prep every summer, and a poem that served as the inspiration for one of the courses at Prep for Prep was William Ernest Henley's Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole. I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. Right. So on one level, this has a lot of the uplift to it that for me as a sixth grader was enriching and vitalizing and empowering. But there's a big but coming. The big but is that this kind of ideological formation does close your eyes to thinking about structural formations of inequality and oppression. Because at the end of the day, the insistence is on your individualized attributes of overcoming, and not on whether the kinds of oppression that you face and that members of your community face are evolving and are continuously shaped by historical and contemporaneous experiences of structural violence that mean that no matter what your attributes of overcoming, more likely than not, the overwhelming majority of Black and brown people in your community are going to remain structurally oppressed. And this is the other dimension to this kind of rhetoric as espoused in Invictus that became increasingly clear to me over the years, and that does, I think, wire into how my sense of racial and ethnic identity snapped into focus. It's worth noting that the work of Prep for Prep is a talented 10th strategy. I mean, like, let's, we gotta call it for what it is, right? And the same criticisms that were leveled at certain high profile proponents of talented 10th strategies are ones that could be leveled at Prep for Prep. But like, to buy into the idea of oneself as a member of the talented 10th is not radically dissimilar from the kinds of sociocultural formation that attend the construction of the privileged poor as a class of the kind that are described in Tony's book, right? So one of these ideas is that the experiences that you encounter, especially at predominantly white institutions, are ones with which you are comfortable, right? You naturalize the idea that you have comfort in these spaces, right? And yeah, like, people may say some hot mess to you, but like, you say, oh no, I've encountered this before, and you can fall back to a degree on a memory of those experiences that have helped steel you or prepare you for what it is. But again, this cuts two ways, and I think that this is where organizations like Prep for Prep still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I would say it's important to realize that programs like Prep, TEAC, A Better Chance, the White Foundation, Oliver Scholars, and the like are resources for the individual or not the collective. And the way in which they are framed, the way in which they are oriented is you are chosen to do the work. And if you do the work, you will succeed. It's not interested in changing the conditions under which people were had to be plucked out of to be given a shot at the Ivy League, right? And so there isn't necessarily that conversation. But what I will say is this: I have noticed, and maybe this is possibly a generational thing, that the luxury to learn about and think about racial identity was more pronounced in students who had access to a curriculum that was more of a liberal arts approach than just teaching to the test. And so that is something that is happening, where I've met more students from prep schools, white, Black, Latinx, Asian, Native, who have read Kill the Indian, Save the Man, the autobiography of Malcolm X, the work of Frederick Douglass, Toni Morrison's complete collection, right? There's fertile ground to develop a racial identity in connection to learning and reading from other scholars, but it's not going to necessarily be encouraged or mandated that you grapple with it, because the real issue is, are you going to be prepared for your freshman year at Princeton, Harvard, and Mercer Williams? That is the question that they are guiding, because if you're ready for day one, that means you are ready for graduation. That means you are ready to go to Goldman Sachs and get that corner office in 10 years. Like, that's the orientation of many of these programs. So yes, it is a narrow conceptualization of what kind of cultural capital matters. It is dominant, it is white. However, there are moments in which that in crafting that white, elite, highly class stock of cultural capital, it presents you with a skill set and orientation to explore and to dive deeper into things like oppression, like slavery, like colonialism, in ways that you won't necessarily have the opportunity to do at many public schools. And so there is this conversation where you have a vocabulary or a skill set to do that secondary racial formation in many ways, but you are not necessarily going to be put down that path by people at prep or those organizations, because they want you to make sure that you're in office hours, that you're at the dinners, you know how to use the right forks, and you're not wearing loud colored socks, you have the right kind of tie, you're doing a half Windsor, not a full Windsor, because that means you're too flashy, right? The kind of coaching and narrow socialization of programs like SEO and things like that, they want you to be able to fit in with the boys at the country club. Not at the, and if you also can talk about the true differences and alignment between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, that's an added bonus. But they want you to be able to chill with the boys in the country club.
Thank you, Professor Jack. We have time, and the questions are rolling in. We have time, unfortunately, for one more question. And this participant is asking, actually, you, Professor Jack, if you could add a 2020 update chapter to your book discussing the impact of current events on the privileged, poor, and doubly disadvantaged, what do you think you would include?
Well, I'm working on the next book project now, and it's going to actually tackle more about the experience of students. It's not a COVID-19 book, but it is using COVID-19 as a moment, as that exogenous shock to understand the experiences of undergraduates. The one thing that I would add is a chapter on going home and the ways in which COVID-19 has actually flattened some of the differences between the privileged, poor, and doubly disadvantaged, but then also exploring where they have exacerbated those differences. Because some of the privileged poor didn't have to go home. They went to some of them had connections or access to different kind of resources. So the going home piece is going to be a major part of that second book project. And I'm very much interested in looking at, for example, so there's two chapters, the going home, but then also working. Did the privileged poor and the doubly disadvantaged and their middle class peers, how different was all of their jobs, and which jobs were safe during the pandemic or pandemic proof, as you can want to call it, and which ones weren't, and which ones bounced back? Because I want to understand how money flowed into the lives of students and how the pandemic actually put up hurdles to that. So those would be the two ways: going home and what jobs were pandemic proof, and who accessed those jobs.
Thank you for that. And I want to personally thank both of you again for engaging in this discussion. For me personally, being in this virtual space with both of you this evening has been truly an honor. I think the conversations around race, privilege, socioeconomic status are important ones, and ones that we need to have more conversations around at our dinner table with our friends, with our family, with our classmates. Again, I want to let participants know that this is a program that's designed to offer students the opportunity, and the wider university community, the opportunity to participate in meaningful discussions like this with some of our very best anti-racist writers, activists, thinkers in the world. And again, I'm so thankful to be with two in this virtual space today. A huge shout out again for Dr. Padilla Peralta, your amazing work. Undocumented, a Dominican boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League. And Dr. Jack, your book, The Privileged Poor, How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students. I want to encourage participants to pick up these books, continue to have these conversations. And I want to thank both of you again for being with us in this virtual space, and thank all of our participants for joining us this evening.